What if the lines we draw between human species are more about politics than the reality of nature? Imagine two groups of humans, living side by side tens of thousands of years ago, sharing tools, territory, and even genes. Are they really so different that we should call them separate species? And why does the British Natural History Museum continue to push this narrative? The answer may surprise you. This question lies at the heart of a heated debate in paleoanthropology. A recent article from the British Natural History Museum titled "Neanderthals and Modern Humans Must be Classed as Separate Species to Best Track Our Origins" indicates that the question is hotly debated. According to the article, a new paper titled "Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and Speciation Complexity in Paleo-anthropology" attempts to address this question. However, many argue that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, the first Europeans, are not distinct species, but different populations of the same species, Homo sapiens. This challenges the paper's conclusion and prompts us to reconsider how we define biological boundaries. The Natural History Museum has also tried to cancel the term Cro-Magnon for political reasons. So we will use the term in this video because it is a valid scientific term to describe the first Europeans, just as Neanderthals is a valid term to describe the group that came before them. The classic biological definition of a species hinges on the ability of two groups to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If they can, they're considered the same species. Yet the paper in question argues that Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, and Cro-Magnons, Homo sapiens, are separate, citing differences in physical traits, behaviors, and evolutionary paths. But is this separation justified, or does it oversimplify a more complex, interconnected reality? Let's dive into the evidence and question the assumptions that underpin such classifications. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons belong to the same species is their ability to interbreed. Genetic studies have shown that when these two groups met around 50,000 years ago, they didn't just coexist, they mixed. Modern non-African humans carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA, a legacy of this intermingling. If two groups can produce viable, fertile offspring, as this genetic legacy suggests, doesn't that align them with the same species under the biological species concept? The paper argues that morphological differences, like Neanderthals' robust builds and distinct skull shapes, outweigh this genetic overlap. But is appearance alone enough to draw such a hard line? Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons shared a recent common ancestor, and their interbreeding produced children who, in turn, had their own offspring. This fertility across generations is a hallmark of a single species. So, why does the paper insist on separation? It's complicated. Beyond genetics, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons also shared cultural and technological practices, further blurring the lines between them. Archaeological evidence shows that both groups used similar tools, buried their dead, and even created art. Cro-Magnons are famous for their cave paintings, but Neanderthals also left behind symbolic objects, like eagle talons arranged as jewelry. If they were engaging in comparable behaviors, doesn't that suggest a shared cognitive and social framework? The separate species concept counters that these similarities are superficial, but isn't the ability to communicate, cooperate, and innovate a deeper indicator of species unity? Think about it. If two groups can understand and mimic each other's behaviors, aren't they part of the same cultural and biological continuum? The paper's emphasis on speciation complexity overlooks this overlap, focusing instead on differences in brain size or cranial features. But does a slightly different skull shape really justify calling them separate species, especially when their lives were so intertwined? This raises a critical question. Are we letting fossil morphology dictate our conclusions more than it should? Another article from the British Natural History Museum by Chris Stringer titled, "Are Neanderthals the same species as us?" asks, but what about the archaeological evidence that is also commonly cited in favor of uniting the Neanderthals with us as Homo sapiens? That they had cultural behaviors such as burying their dead and painting designs on the walls of caves. Well, interesting as that is, it should be excluded from the biological classification of species, since behaviors are potentially more plastic, evolve more quickly and spread more easily within and between species than traits based on anatomy and DNA. In addition, demonstrating that a past human species had a particular behavior is sometimes difficult to establish from the archaeological record, the museum concludes. It's worth taking a deep dive to address this point directly, as it hinges on dismissing behavioral evidence like burial practices and cave art as irrelevant and unreliable for classifying Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. While it is easy to understand the concern about the plasticity and difficulty of interpreting behaviors, suggesting that it's unreasonable to consider them at all is itself a stretch. Behaviors, far from being mere noise, can offer critical insights into the cognitive and social capacities of these groups, which are deeply tied to their biological identity. Many researchers refute this dismissal and argue that ignoring behavioral evidence is not only short-sighted, but undermines a holistic understanding of species classification. The Natural History Museum claims that behaviors like burying the dead and painting on cave walls are irrelevant to species classification because they're potentially more plastic, evolve more quickly, and spread more easily than anatomical or DNA traits, and that they're hard to establish from the archaeological record. But isn't it absurd to throw out such rich evidence simply because it's complex? Behaviors aren't just side notes, they're windows into the minds, cultures, and evolutionary pressures that shaped Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. To dismiss them as unreliable or secondary is to ignore half the story of what makes a species a species. First, let's tackle the plasticity argument. Sure, behaviors can change fast and spread through cultural exchange, but that's precisely why they matter. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons both engaged in symbolic behaviors like burial and art, doesn't that suggest a shared cognitive capacity that's as fundamental to their identity as their bone structure? The ability to create meaning, mourn the dead, or express creativity isn't some superficial add-on. It's a hallmark of advanced hominid evolution, likely rooted in their shared biology. To say it's irrelevant because it's plastic is like saying language doesn't matter in humans because accents can change. Ridiculous, right? Now, about the difficulty of establishing these behaviors from the archaeological record. Yes, it's tricky. Cave paintings can degrade, and burial sites can be misinterpreted. But the same can be said for fossils and DNA. Fossils are rare, often fragmented, and subject to speculation in how we interpret them. DNA can be contaminated or incomplete, yet we don't dismiss those entirely. Why should behavior be held to a higher standard of proof? The evidence we do have, Neanderthal burials with grave goods, pigments found at their sites, and Neanderthal cave art overlapping with Cro-Magnon cave paintings in time and space, shows striking parallels. To wave that off as too hard to pin down is to miss the forest for the trees. And here's the kicker. Behaviors aren't isolated from anatomy and DNA. They're products of the brain, which is itself a biological trait. If Neanderthals had the neural wiring to bury their dead or make art, that capacity is as much a part of their species definition as their skull shape. The Natural History Museum leans on anatomical and genetic data, but it's laughable to think we can fully understand speciation without considering how these populations thought and acted. Species aren't just bodies. They're living, breathing entities with minds, and behaviors give us a glimpse into those minds. Now let's flip the script. Instead of seeing behaviors as a liability, what if they're a bridge connecting Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons as part of the same species, Homo sapiens? Both groups buried their dead, sometimes with flowers or grave goods, suggesting rituals and care for the deceased. Both created art. Neanderthals used pigments and made jewelry, while Cro-Magnons painted vivid scenes on cave walls. These aren't random acts. They're signs of symbolic thought, a trait we've long considered uniquely human. If two groups share such advanced behaviors, isn't that a stronger argument for unity than any minor difference in brow ridges? The point about behaviors evolving quickly and spreading easily actually strengthens this case. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons could adopt and adapt each other's practices, doesn't that show they were part of the same cultural and biological network? The paper might argue for separation based on physical traits, but if these groups were exchanging ideas and practices, their boundaries blur. It's not ridiculous to suggest behaviors matter, it's ridiculous to ignore them. Species classification isn't just about measuring bones or sequencing genes. It's about understanding how organisms live, interact, and evolve as whole beings. Dismissing behavior as irrelevant is like trying to understand a bird without ever watching it fly. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons weren't just collections of DNA and skeletons. They were populations with cultures, tools, and ways of life. Their shared behaviors suggest they were cognitively and socially aligned, which is as much a part of their species identity as their anatomy. Take burial, for example. Neanderthals at sites like Shanidar Cave showed evidence of deliberate burial, possibly with symbolic intent. Cro-Magnons did the same. If both groups recognize death in similar ways, doesn't that indicate a shared level of consciousness and social structure? The idea that this is too plastic to count ignores the fact that plasticity itself can be a species trait. Humans today are incredibly adaptable in our behaviors, yet we're all Homo sapiens. Why shouldn't that apply to our ancestors? The suggestion that behavior is irrelevant doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's not ridiculous to look at all available evidence. It's ridiculous to arbitrarily exclude a whole category of data because it's messy. Science thrives on complexity, not simplification. The archaeological record may be imperfect, but it's our best tool for understanding the past. To say we should ignore behaviors because they're hard to interpret is like saying we should ignore the weather forecast because some measurements are uncertain. It's a cop-out, not a reasoned stance. Moreover, the focus on anatomical and genetic separation might itself be flawed if it overlooks how behaviors reflect underlying biological similarities. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons shared the brainpower for art and ritual, their biology was clearly compatible enough to warrant classification as the same species. In short, dismissing behavioral evidence as irrelevant and unreliable is not only short-sighted, it's downright absurd. Behaviors like burial and art aren't distractions. They're essential pieces of the puzzle that show Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were more alike than different, likely part of the same species, Homo sapiens. The Natural History Museum might prioritize anatomy and DNA, but to ignore how these groups lived, thought, and interacted is to miss the full scope of their humanity. In fact, the 2% Neanderthal DNA in modern humans isn't just about genes, it's about the legacy of their shared ways of life too. According to several recent studies, modern Europeans inherited genes for blonde and red hair, blue eyes, and skin pigmentation from Neanderthals because those genes were positively selected for because they lived in the same environments and likely had shared cultural practices. So the next time someone claims behaviors don't matter in species classification, ask yourself, if we can't learn from how our ancestors acted, what are we even studying? The richness of their lives, their creativity, their rituals, their connections, deserves a place at the table, not a dismissive shrug. It's not ridiculous to include behavior. It's ridiculous to pretend we can understand species without it. Another point to consider is the ecological niche these groups occupied. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons often lived in the same regions, competing for the same resources like food, shelter, and mating partners. If they were truly separate species, we might expect them to have avoided each other or occupied entirely different habitats like lions and tigers. Instead, their ranges overlapped significantly, and they likely interacted regularly. Doesn't this coexistence suggest they were adaptable variations of the same species, rather than distinct evolutionary branches? The Natural History Museum argues that their differences in adaptation, Neanderthals' stockier builds suited for cold climates versus Cro-Magnons' more gracile frames, indicate separate evolutionary paths. But isn't adaptation just natural variation within a species? Humans today vary widely in height, skin color, and build based on environment, yet we're all Homo sapiens. Why should prehistoric humans be any different? This overlap in ecology challenges the paper's premise and invites us to ask, are we overemphasizing minor physical distinctions at the expense of broader similarities? Genetically, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were remarkably similar. Their genomes differ by less than 0.1%, which is a minuscule gap compared to the differences between, say, humans and chimpanzees. This closeness suggests they were not only capable of interbreeding, but also part of a continuous gene pool. The Natural History Museum points to specific genetic markers or fossil evidence to argue for separation, but these markers could just as easily be regional variations, like dialects in a language. If we accept that small genetic differences don't create new species, why should we treat Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons as exceptions? Moreover, the presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans isn't just a historical footnote. It's a living testament to their shared species status. Every time someone with European or Asian ancestry inherits a snippet of Neanderthal DNA, they're carrying forward a legacy of interspecies mingling. Doesn't this continuity undermine the idea of rigid species boundaries? The paper's focus on speciation complexity might miss this forest for the trees, prioritizing theoretical models over empirical data. Now, let's turn directly to the separate species concept itself, which grapples with the complexity of speciation in paleoanthropology, emphasizing the challenges of distinguishing Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons as separate lineages. But what if this complexity is more a reflection of our analytical tools than a true biological divide? The paper leans on fossil scarcity or genomic gaps to justify separation, but these gaps could just as easily be artifacts of preservation rather than evidence of distinct species. For instance, the Natural History Museum argues that Middle Pleistocene hominins represent distinct lineages, but this assumes a linear, tree-like model of evolution that doesn't always hold up. If we accept that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons are the same species, what does that mean for our understanding of human evolution? Evolution isn't always a neat branching process. It can be messy, with populations blending and diverging in ways that defy simple categorization. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were part of a single, fluid population, with occasional isolation and reconnection, doesn't that suggest they're better seen as subspecies or regional variants rather than separate species? Another potential flaw in the approach is its reliance on morphological differences. While Neanderthals had larger brow ridges and more robust skeletons, these traits could be adaptations to specific environments, not indicators of a new species. Humans today show similar variation, yet we don't classify these groups as separate species. Why then do we do so for our ancient relatives? This double standard calls into question the paper's foundational assumptions. But why does the Natural History Museum hold firm on the notion that Neanderthals are a separate and inferior species when many paleoanthropologists argue that they are a population within the Homo sapiens species? Chris Stringer, the co-author of the paper, is a prominent paleoanthropologist and research leader in human origins at the Natural History Museum. He is a leading proponent of a hypothesis which posits that modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa over 100,000 years ago and later migrated to replace other archaic human populations, such as Neanderthals. His work is well documented, with extensive publications and projects like the Ancient Human Occupation of Britain and Pathways to Ancient Britain. He was also the leader of a group that did the controversial reconstruction of Cheddar Man. These projects, as noted in various sources, have been largely funded by the Caliver Foundation. The Caliver Foundation is mentioned repeatedly as a funding body for the Natural History Museum's Human Origins Research Fund. According to public information, the foundation has supported initiatives like the Pathways to Ancient Britain project. The foundation is owned by Stephen and Caroline Butt and has given at least £10 million to the Centre for Human Origins in the last several years alone. The Caliver Foundation, their family trust, funds projects in arts, culture, science and heritage, but their largest recent donations were to the Human Origins Research Fund at the Natural History Museum. The couple's ownership stake in the controversial Mighty Group raises concerns about their motives in funding scientific research. If the Neanderthals are a separate and inferior species, narrative is used to bolster a human origin story that downplays human evolution in Europe. It could serve broader goals. Science should not be a tool for corporate image management. The Kaleva Foundation's funding of the Natural History Museum could exert pressure to prioritize a model of human evolution which aligns with a specific message. You can take a look at the links provided in the description to make up your mind about that. The donations don't reveal direct control, but their wealth and political connections likely influence research priorities. If alternative theories are downplayed to maintain funding or public appeal, this undermines scientific integrity. Science should be driven by evidence, not by donors with agendas. However, science shouldn't be about agendas. It's about evidence. If the Natural History Museum's position is driven more by institutional inertia or funding than by data, it undermines trust in their role as a neutral arbiter of truth. If the Kaleva Foundation pushes a separate but not equal evolution narrative, it suppresses dissenting scientific voices and alternative models. This is particularly concerning if their business interests benefit from a homogenized view of humanity that justifies certain policies or practices. Science should embrace complexity, not cater to reductive narratives. If Neanderthals are a subspecies of Homo sapiens, it suggests they're not a distinct evolutionary branch, but rather a regional variant of the same species. This blurs the line between us, Homo sapiens, and them, Neanderthals, making it harder to draw a clear starting point for modern humans. The Natural History Museum's model relies on a clean origin story. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, migrated into Eurasia, and replaced or absorbed other hominids. If Neanderthals are part of Homo sapiens, their existence in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived undermines this timeline. Were Neanderthals always Homo sapiens, or did they diverge and then converge? This ambiguity challenges the simplicity of a single cradle of evolution. The Natural History Museum wants a straightforward ancestor-descendant relationship, but a subspecies classification implies a more fluid, networked evolution where populations intermingled, diverged, and reconnected. This messes with the linear tree model of evolution they favor, replacing it with a messier web. The separate species model supports the idea that modern humans replaced Neanderthals through competition, interbreeding, or other factors, with Neanderthals eventually going extinct. If Neanderthals are a subspecies, the story shifts to one of assimilation rather than replacement. Their extinction becomes less about a clash of species and more about regional population dynamics within Homo sapiens. This makes it harder to claim that Homo sapiens evolved solely in Africa and then took over the world, as it suggests populations of Homo sapiens were already outside Africa long before the supposed African exodus. The Natural History Museum's narrative depends on modern humans being a superior species that emerged from Africa. A subspecies classification for Neanderthals, and Denisovans for that matter, implies that Homo sapiens was already a widespread, diverse species, with African and non-African populations evolving in parallel, which contradicts the singular African origin story. As discussed, genetic studies show Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, with 2% of non-African genomes coming from Neanderthals. If they're separate species, this interbreeding is an exception, a brief overlap. But if they are subspecies, it's a normal part of Homo sapiens diversity, like interbreeding between human populations today. Fossil evidence also becomes trickier. Transitional fossils showing mixed traits, for example, late Neanderthals with more modern features, would no longer be hybrids but natural variants, complicating how we date and map human origins. The Natural History Museum relies on clear genetic and fossil markers to build their timeline. A subspecies model forces them to rethink these markers, invalidating years of research based on the separate species assumption. If Neanderthals are classified as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, then they represent a non-African population of Homo sapiens that evolved outside Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. This contradicts the out-of-Africa model, which claims Homo sapiens originated exclusively in Africa around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago and then spread out. Instead, a subspecies classification suggests Homo sapiens was already a diverse species, with African and Eurasian populations evolving in parallel. The recent African origin of modern humans narrative falls apart because Neanderthals, as a subspecies, would mean Homo sapiens had roots both in and out of Africa from early on. The separate species model allows the Natural History Museum to argue that modern Homo sapiens replaced archaic humans like Neanderthals, but a subspecies model implies continuous evolution within Homo sapiens, with no sharp break between archaic and modern. Neanderthals wouldn't be a side branch that went extinct. They'd be a regional population that merged back into the broader Homo sapiens population. This challenges the idea of a single African species migrating out and dominating, suggesting instead an Afro-Eurasian network of Homo sapiens populations exchanging genes and cultures. If Neanderthals are a subspecies, their interbreeding with modern humans isn't an anomaly but a natural process within Homo sapiens. The Natural History Museum's narrative of interbreeding as a brief event between distinct species loses its punch, and the 2% Neanderthal DNA in non-Africans becomes just part of Homo sapiens diversity, not a foreign contribution. A subspecies classification aligns more with the multi-regional hypothesis, which argues that modern humans evolved simultaneously in different regions with gene flow between them. This directly contradicts the Natural History Museum's out-of-Africa model, which dismisses multi-regionalism. The Natural History Museum resists this because it undermines their tidy story and threatens their funding and narrative, as multi-regionalism is less straightforward. The Natural History Museum resists classifying Neanderthals as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis because it disrupts their core narrative, challenges their scientific authority, and complicates their research. They've built their reputation on the out-of-Africa model, supported by fossils, genetics, and popular media. A subspecies classification would force them to admit that human evolution wasn't a straight line from Africa, but a tangled web, with Neanderthals as part of Homo sapiens all along, and therefore our direct ancestors, and they didn't go extinct. This isn't just academic, it's a threat to their funding, including from the Caliver Foundation. Moreover, the Natural History Museum's insistence on separate species maintains a clear other for modern humans to contrast against, reinforcing the idea that we're a unique, superior lineage. A subspecies model flattens that hierarchy, suggesting Neanderthals were just us with different adaptations, which might be harder for the public and donors to support. This reclassification also has ethical implications. If Neanderthals were part of our species, their extinction takes on a different tone, not as the demise of a rival, but as a loss within our own family. It prompts us to ask, how should we view our ancient relatives, and what lessons can we learn from their fate? The paper's insistence on separation might inadvertently perpetuate a view of Neanderthals as having gone extinct, when the evidence suggests they were very much part of us. So, are Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons separate species, as the Natural History Museum argues? Or are they variations of the same species, Homo sapiens? The evidence of interbreeding, shared culture, ecological overlap, and genetic continuity points strongly toward the latter. The focus on speciation complexity might be valuable for academic debate, but it risks missing the bigger picture, that these groups were more alike than different, connected by a shared evolutionary journey. The Natural History Museum's insistence on separating Neanderthals shapes how we understand human origins. Their press release's confidence masks ongoing debates in paleoanthropology. By doubling down on separate species, the Natural History Museum risks alienating critics and missing a chance to embrace a more integrated view of human evolution. The Natural History Museum insists that Neanderthals must be a separate species to track our origins, maintain taxonomic tradition, and preserve their scientific authority. The press release, disguised as a scientific study, reflects the Natural History Museum's commitment to a linear narrative. But recent studies suggest this view is increasingly contested. If the goal is to truly understand human origins, the Natural History Museum should consider whether their insistence on separation serves science or their own institutional interests. So, if Neanderthals are a subspecies, Homo sapiens didn't evolve solely in Africa as a separate species and then rapidly take over the world in an ancient manifest destiny. Instead, Homo sapiens emerged as a broader, more flexible species with roots in both Africa and Eurasia, evolving through regional variation and interbreeding. This messes with the Natural History Museum's story, but it might be closer to the truth. Recent studies show growing evidence of this continuity. Neanderthal and human genomes are nearly identical, interbreeding was sustained, and behaviors overlapped. The Natural History Museum's stance isn't about science, it's about preserving a narrative. This isn't just an academic quibble, it's a chance to rethink how we define humanity itself. If we can bridge the gap between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, what other boundaries might we dissolve?